So thank you everyone for joining us. I'll just pop through to the next slide if that's okay. We're here today to talk about the Draft Infrastructure Investment Objectives Report. And as always, before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and sea across Australia and the traditional owners of the lands on where we're meeting today, which will be many and varied, I imagine. I acknowledge their enduring connection to land, sea, air and sky, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal people on the webinar today. I'm joining you from Wallamedigal land by the Parramatta River in Gladesville, and that's the land where Bennelong rests and where snapper is a traditional source of food. So my name is Fiona Thompson and I'm an independent facilitator from the RPS group. I'm here to assist with moderating today's Q&A session, which we'll be having after the formal presentation. A few quick points and housekeeping that you'll see up on the screen today. You've joined a Teams webinar call, so you'll see that your microphone and camera should automatically be off. We do ask that everyone please remains muted and with their cameras off for the duration of the webinar. We also ask sorry about that. We'll also be recording today's webinar and we're publishing it on the EMO Services website in the coming days. So today you'll see up on the screen there's a QR code. We're going to be taking the questions through Slido, and that means you can ask directly from your phone. So if you're not a QR code user, I imagine most of you are probably quite familiar with these following COVID, but you just need to aim your camera at the funny looking little picture on the bottom left of the screen, and it will take you to the correct link in your browser. So please join the Q&A now, and that way if you've got questions during the presentation, you can ask them as we keep going. So just noting as well, there might be a little delay in between when you type your question and it appears in the question box. This is really normal. There's no need to ask the same question again. However, if you are interested in hearing the answer to a question that's already been asked in the Q&A, you can like the question by giving it a thumbs up. This will help us to prioritise the questions during the Q&A at the end of the session if we get a lot of questions. So you'll also notice that the chat on this Teams webinar hasn't been enabled, so you won't be able to use that function. And we won't be able to respond to any raised hands today. So we do ask that you don't raise your hand because we'll be using this function later for the presenters to let us know who's going to answer the next question as well. So just a reminder, if you do have a question, please use the Slido. And if for some reason that you aren't able to access the Slido, there's a number on the screen where you can text your question, and that number is 0425 413 902. So as you know, this is a consultation. So if we don't get to your question, there'll be details for how you can ask it in another way at the end of the presentation. So over to our presenters today. And today's presenters bring a wealth of experience in planning for Australia's energy future. I'm joined by a number of team members from EMO Services and AEMO. So Melanie Kerner from EMO Services is the General Manager of System Planning and Renewable Energy Zones. We also have Eli Pack from AEMO, and he's the Group Manager System Planning. So you'll first hear from Melanie and Eli during the formal presentation as part of today's briefing, and then they'll be joined by Shira Samocha and Dane Winch for the Q&A session. So both Shira and Dane are subject matter experts on these topics. Shira is the Modelling Manager in System Planning and Renewable Energy Zones for EMO Services, and Dane is EMO's Manager of Regional Development. So over to the webinar agenda. As I've just mentioned, we'll first hear from Melanie and Eli, who'll tell you about the IIO modelling methodology, the draft development pathway and the 10-year plan. We'll then take questions through Slido, as we've mentioned already, and through the phone number we shared earlier before we wrap up. So for those who've just joined, please make sure you scan the QR code on the screen and ask your questions throughout the presentation. We'll also flash this up at the screen at the end so that you can ask questions then. So without further ado, I will hand over to Melanie for the formal presentation.
Thank you, Fiona, and welcome everyone to our Draft 2023 IIO webinar. So just to start off with a bit of introduction to AEMO Services for those who aren't familiar with us. So AEMO Services was created now just over 18 months ago as an independent subsidiary of AEMO. So AMO Services was created to deliver our foundational role, which is to act as the New South Wales Consumer Trustee in the delivery of the New South Wales Government's electricity infrastructure roadmap. So as part of our role as the New South Wales Consumer Trustee, we have a function to produce these infrastructure investment objective reports every 2 years. And then those reports are then used to guide our repeatable tenders and also to perform our other functions such as authorising RES network infrastructure projects. So go to the next slide. So about the Draft 2023 IIO report. So this is our third IIO report. Our initial report was published in December 2021, and then we had a second IIO report published in October 22 to respond to a direction for a firming tender from the Minister. This third report is the first report that we've undertaken deep consultation on, so we're really interested in hearing all stakeholders' view as we finalise the draft report, with that due in December of this year. So like all our IIO reports, it's underpinned by extensive modelling that's undertaken by AEMO for AEMO services. That modelling co-optimises investment in generation, long-duration storage, firming and network infrastructure to help develop our 10-year plan and development pathways. This draft 2023 IIO report is based on assumptions which largely align to AEMO's 2022 ISP, but have been updated in some instances to reflect more recent information. There are also some more recent announcements that have not been able to be incorporated in the modelling. So, for example, the delay to SNOIP 2.0 Origin's announcement of the Eraring Big Battery. Those projects are not yet considered in the modelling, but we intend to do that, as well as to update for AEMO's latest assumptions for our final 2023 IIO report. So after this consultation, we intend to incorporate feedback, latest assumptions, and then update for the final 2023 IIO report. One of the major changes of this report compared to previous reports is in our 10-year plans for generation and long-duration storage, which we've now adopted a more regular size tenders, and we think this provides greater certainty and simplicity for our proponents who are going to be participating in the tenders, but keen to receive feedback on the 10-year plans. And as Fiona said, we're welcoming consultation and submissions, in particular, submissions due by the end of June. So a reminder about what are the IIOs, the infrastructure investment objectives. There are three types of there are three categories of infrastructure that the IIOs relate to: generation, long duration storage, and firming. Generation under the New South Wales Government roadmap is defined as renewable energy generation that has to be greater than 30 megawatts. For generation, we have two objectives that we have to seek to meet. We have our minimum objectives, which are the objectives that we have to achieve by 2030. And for renewable generation, that is, we need to construct at least the same amount as 12 gigawatts, which equates to roughly 33.6 terawatt hours per annum of generation. And that needs to be achieved by 2030. To 2030 and beyond, we also identify renewable generation that's required to continue to minimise electricity costs for New South Wales consumers. Long duration storage is storage that's able to be dispatched at its registered capacity for more than 8 hours, and it must be scheduled by AEMO in its central dispatch process. We have a minimum objective for long duration storage, which is to construct 2 gigawatts by 2030, and that long duration storage should also be used to meet the reliability standard, which is defined in our regulations. Firming infrastructure is a little bit different. For firming infrastructure, we only include firming infrastructure within our development pathway and in our tenders where we've been directed by the Minister to do so. That occurred last year following the announcement of the intention for Origin's Eraring coal-fired power plant to retire in 25-26. And when we had that direction, that meant that we then produced a firming IIO report to meet the infrastructure investment objective of the reliability and the energy security target. And that firming tender is currently underway. So we'll go to the next slide. Oh, and I'll hand over to Eli. Eli will talk through AEMO and AEMO's role in preparing the Infrastructure Investment Objectives Report. Thanks, Eli.
Thanks, Melanie, and hi everyone. It's great to see so much interest in today's webinar. I thought I'd start out today by highlighting some of the things that AEMO does and the distinction between AEMO, where I work, and AEMO Services, where Melanie works. So at AEMO, we manage electricity and gas systems and markets across Australia, helping to ensure that Australians have access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable energy now and into the future. Within AEMO, I lead the system planning group, and we're largely responsible for AEMO's national transmission planner function, which involves a lot of joint planning with transmission companies, lots of consumer and industry engagement, and a wide range of studies and reports. So things like the integrated system plan, inertia and system strength reports, and a lot of support that we provide for things like the electricity and the gas statements of opportunities. And we also provide advisory services to governments, to market bodies, and to AEMO services. So when you're looking at something published by AEMO Services, I think it is somewhat important to appreciate that AEMO Services is distinct from AEMO, with a different board, a different leadership team, and different staff. So any of my work that AEMO does for AEMO Services, it's charged out, with those costs being recovered through the New South Wales legislative framework. And with that said, there is still strong collaboration, of course, between the organisations. And while AEMO Services was created initially for this New South Wales function, they are open to supporting other jurisdictions should that need arise. So moving on to the next slide, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Integrated System Plan and how it relates to the Draft IIO report. So for anyone who's not particularly familiar with the Integrated System Plan or the ISP, it's a roadmap for the efficient development of the East Coast power system out to 2050. The most recent ISP was developed with involvement from over 1,500 stakeholders. We had 31 forums and webinars, and we went through 198 different written submissions with just continuous dialogue on every aspect of the project. That exhaustive consultation that we undertook was very much instrumental in developing the rigor behind the ISP. And that rigor has stood up to market events over the past 11 months since we published it last year. And the step change scenario that came out of the ISP, it continues to be the industry standard for planning in the electricity sector. So the Draft IIO report that we're here to discuss, it's a 20-year plan that leverages those inputs, assumptions, scenarios, and the methodologies that we developed in the ISP. And importantly, the IIO report becomes an input to the next ISP process. So in that way, the same as any policy folds into the ISP, we get this continuous cycle between the ISP and the IIO. Both the ISP and the IIO report serve critical but distinct purposes. So the IIO report sets out a plan that maximizes value to New South Wales electricity consumers, and it's then operationalized through a series of tenders. Whereas the ISP, it's more of a NEM-wide plan, so across the whole East Coast power system, that optimizes total system costs while meeting legislated state policies and our national commitment to a net zero economy by 2050. Looking at the next slide, I will briefly talk to the modeling methodology that we use before I pass back to Melanie to discuss some of the insights from that work. So if you've been involved in our ISP methodology consultation, this diagram will look somewhat familiar to you. The general market modelling objectives for the IIO broadly follow those that we deploy in the ISP and in the electricity statement of opportunities. So starting at the top of this diagram, we have extensive consultation, which I mentioned earlier, that we conduct for the preparation of the fixed and modelled inputs. This includes things like the demand forecasts, the fuel costs, and the network expansion options. And then those inputs and assumptions for the draft IIO report, which are consistent with the latest ISP. There's just a handful of more fit for purpose changes that we apply. So those exemptions, they are detailed in the report, of course, but they include things like updated network options that EnergyCo provides. So continuing down the diagram, those inputs at the top are fed into a capacity outlook model, which I think of as the heart of the model of models. The capacity outlook model aims to optimize the mix of generation, storage, and network investments. As I said before, the IIO methodology optimizes those investments with respect to New South Wales consumer costs, rather than total system costs across the NEM. So compared to the ISP methodology, there is a material increase in the modelling effort required here, since we have a need to explore things like the wholesale prices, network charges, and the cost of long-term energy supply agreements. The time sequential and reliability models are then used to verify what comes out of the capacity outlook model. And that allows us to ensure that we achieve the minimum infrastructure objectives while providing a reliable and affordable system for New South Wales consumers. So these models replicate the processes used operationally in the national electricity market and in the dispatch engine that happens operationally, with detailed transmission constraints, bids, outages, and maintenance profiles. The capacity, time sequential, and reliability outlook models are then run in a sort of iterative fashion until we converge on a suitable development pathway that minimizes New South Wales consumer costs while meeting the policy and annual build limits for things like supply chain limitations. So that's a bit of an overview of how the methodology works. I'll hand over now to Melanie, who'll speak to the next slides and to the draft development pathway that we've produced for the IIO. Thanks, Melanie.
Thank you, Eli. So I'll start with the scenarios that AEMO modelled for AEMO services and that are presented in the draft IIO report. We have 4 scenarios. The draft development pathway and the draft 10-year plan are based on the central scenario, and that's because it's considered the most likely scenario. The central scenario aligns with the step change scenario in AEMO's 2022 ISP, with some assumptions updated where we could reflect more recent information. The other 3 scenarios that we've modelled here were undertaken to understand how the development pathway might need to change should these scenarios eventuate. The first scenario, the no coal by 2030 strong electrification scenario, it largely aligns with the hydrogen superpower scenario that was presented in the 2022 ISP. We also looked at a scenario, a perhaps less extreme scenario, but still where transmission was delayed for 1 to 2 years for the main critical transmission projects. It was aligned to central, but with delays in those projects. And then the final scenario was an early coal exit, not quite as much as the no coal by 2030 scenario, but it did assume that Bayswater Power Station retires by June 2030. And to respond to that, some transmission augmentations were accelerated. So as I said, these 3 scenarios were not used directly to prepare the development pathway, but they were used to understand what might need to occur should those scenarios transpire. So this chart here shows the overall results of AEMO's modelling in terms of the capacity that is needed on a year-by-year basis. So if we start back in FY 23-24, we project that there will be 2.2 gigawatts of wind and 3.6 gigawatts of large-scale solar by that year. Now, of that, 2.4 gigawatts can be counted towards the 2030 targets, having been committed since November 2019. If we then fast forward to 2030, there is still a large task for the delivery of central infrastructure, wind, solar, and our LDS projects at the same time as investment in the decentralised part of the network is occurring as well. Our most recent LTESA tender saw us lock in 4.1 gigawatts of renewable generation by 2026, getting us somewhat closer to those 2030 targets. And of course, the job doesn't stop. In 2030, the modelling identified that more generation and storage and firming and long duration storage would be required out to 2040 to continue to minimise cost to New South Wales consumers, as well as providing for our reliability and energy security needs. Next slide. For our actual development pathway, though, it is technology agnostic. So we do not prescribe the technologies that will form part of the development pathway, but rather we tender for what technologies represent best value to New South Wales consumers. The development pathway here shows that even past 2030, we continue to invest in renewable generation to minimise cost to consumers. And we intend to tender for that generation every 6 months, as was indicated in our previous IIO reports. But the difference in this IIO report is that we're setting consistent size tenders so that we will seek to award an indicative amount of 3,000 gigawatt hours per annum for each 6 monthly tender for each 6 monthly tender going forwards to the end of the 10-year plan. Again, those volumes are indicative, and so we will award what actually is recommended will depend on the value that we see within the tenders. Next slide. The development pathway for long duration storage looks a little bit different. So we have our 2030 target of 2 gigawatts, which the development pathway shows is largely back-ended. It's been delayed slightly since our previous IIO reports, which did have some long duration storage coming on in 2026. The reason for this is that there's been updated assumptions around the lead times for pumped hydro projects, as well as the costs in technologies, such that the modelling identifies that it's more in the interest of consumers to delay that 2 gigawatts more to the back end of the first decade. That said, we still intend to run tenders every year, every year to identify whether those assumptions hold true. So we are looking to understand whether batteries can outperform some of those assumptions. Batteries or other technologies can outperform some of those technologies such that we may bring them on earlier. Because, of course, leaving the 2 gigawatts to the very end of the decade does represent some risks if we're waiting to that time and assuming that projects will come in. So we're continuing to explore what the market can provide by our annual tenders run every year. We have indicated a size of 1 gigawatt for each tender that we would award. But of course, we will keep running those tenders up to 1 gigawatt until such time as we hit our 2 gigawatt target. And so this chart here shows that it may be that we can fulfill that target earlier, and if we don't, there's contingent tenders that we run out till approximately 2028 until such time as we hit the target. Next slide. So our firming development pathway remains quite similar to the firming development pathway that we included in the 2022 IIO report with an indicative amount of 380 megawatts to be recommended in our first tender, which is currently underway. And then this modelling showed that under the central scenario, and assuming that 2 gigawatts of long duration storage comes in, then no further firming infrastructure is needed to 2040. This particular development pathway was highly sensitive to some of our other assumptions, such as delays to transmission projects. So if there are actual changes to what we've assumed, such as increases in peak demand, early coal retirement, or if key transmission projects are delayed, then we might expect more firming infrastructure would be required. And that would ultimately be the minister's decision. If those circumstances arose, the minister could then decide to direct AEMO services to run another firming infrastructure tender. But at this stage, it is only that 1 firming infrastructure tender for that a minimum amount of 380 megawatts that is currently underway. Under our regulations, we are required to include a forecast of costs costs of wholesale energy costs to New South Wales consumers, as well as the costs resulting from LTESs and other scheme costs. So this chart here presents the overall costs over that 20-year period of $78 billion. So they include wholesale costs of electricity and costs of the LTESs, the LTESA liabilities that result from our tenders, and then as well as costs for transmission infrastructure that proceed under the New South Wales framework. So this $78 billion of cost is not a new cost. This is the cost that could be compared to the wholesale energy cost that the New South Wales consumers would have otherwise incurred had there been no policy, no roadmap policy. The New South Wales Office of Energy and Climate Change are undertaking modelling via AEMO as well to understand what the cost to New South Wales consumers would have been in the absence of the roadmap policy. And draft results of that modelling suggest that the cost to New South Wales consumers in the absence of the roadmap would have been $10.6 billion higher than the $78 billion modelled here. So what we would like to do today is to understand your questions and how we might better facilitate responses through a series of deep dive sessions, which will commence on the week beginning 5th of June. So we're asking for feedback on those topics, and again, written submissions by the 30th of June, which will be considered as we commence our modelling in around July, with the intention to release the final report in December 2023. Thanks, Fiona. Back to you.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, I did notice that as we were going through, we had a number of people joining the call who may not have heard the instructions around how to ask your questions. So you'll see up on the screen, again, we've put up the link to the question and answer session through Slido. So please join that using your QR code. And if you're unable to access it, also feel free to text your question to 0425 413 902. I might just leave the slide up just for a minute or two to make sure that everyone's got it there. And you can follow along from the Slido either on your phone or your computer and see which questions have already been asked. Make sure to go through and like any of the questions that other people have asked that you're interested in the answer to. I can see at the moment that the most popular question is around, will the slide presentation be shared to attendees? And as you will have seen at the start of the call, it's, we're recording today's webinar. So the webinar in its entirety will be published to the AEMO Services website in the coming days. And so it will be available through that location. So that one's all answered. I might just start running through the other questions and answers and ask that each of the presenters turn their camera on, ready to go, please. And Joe, you can probably stop sharing the screen now. I think people should have had time to get into that link. So Mel, there's a question here on whether the figure for new wind capacity is inclusive of likely large-scale offshore wind developments in the Newcastle and Wollongong region. So I might throw that to you.
Thanks, Fiona. I will throw to Shira as well to answer that. But in terms of offshore wind, we take our assumptions. We do consider offshore wind in the modelling in the same way that AEMO does for its ISP, and take our assumptions from AEMO. But I'll get Shira to talk through what actual results we saw in terms of offshore wind.
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks for the question. In the modelling that Melanie has gone through in the generation development pathway, the wind projects included to meet our minimum objectives and across the 20-year development pathway don't include offshore wind. In this instance, we are, as Melanie mentioned, really keen to consider these in the future, and also interested in people's feedback on how these should be, what the role of these are and how these should be assumed. We do use assumptions at the moment from AEMO around around these, and they're considered, although they weren't selected in the forecast.
Fantastic. Now, the next question is also for Mel and or Shira. It's around whether the 2 gigawatt target of LDS is reached by batteries before pumped hydro projects. If that happens before the hydro projects reach financial close, what is the future of those pumped hydro projects?
That's an interesting question. I think there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment around what this 2 gigawatts is going to be comprised of, and whether it will be batteries or pumped hydro. I think if we do hit, so the theoretical, if we do hit the 2 gigawatts with batteries and not pumped hydro, it would have had to mean that batteries would have performed very well in our tenders, and that costs would have come down compared to what we're seeing in the assumptions now for them to beat out pumped hydro. But if theoretically that did occur, and we hit our 2 gigawatts without pumped hydro, there would be no constraints on pumped hydro continuing to proceed. And in fact, our modelling does identify that we do need long duration storage following 2030, albeit a bit later, but that they would be welcome to participate in tenders for long duration storage going forwards. And every time we produce our IIO report, we are going to be identifying whether there is more need for long duration storage beyond 2030. So there is still room for pumped hydro to participate if in the hypothetical case it doesn't meet the 2030 target.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, Mel, the next one is also for you. You're very popular today. So Ben has asked, what is the impact of the significant amount of new transmission infrastructure on retail prices if it all gets built? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, we did have, so our modelling shows that the present value of the transmission infrastructure costs to New South Wales consumers is 3.6 billion. I think that's right, Shira, over the 20-year period. And so that is the cost of the New South Wales framework transmission projects that we expect New South Wales consumers to incur over that 20-year period. That is a little bit different to some of the costs you might have seen published recently. They are construction costs. So we do say in our IIO report that there's $9.5 billion of construction costs for transmission, but because that cost is recovered over the lifetime of the transmission projects, that equates to it ends up being 3.6 billion that's recovered during that 20-year period.
Fantastic. And Ben, I think, has asked a follow-up question around if the LTESA costs are recovered by the distribution network, how will these costs be made transparent to consumers?
So the AER contribution determination process is the process via which AER publishes the costs that are recovered from distribution networks. Some of that is commercial in confidence. So the first AER contribution was published earlier this year, and some of that was confidential. And so I think it's a question for AER in terms of what will be made available over the coming years. And perhaps I know there's lots of DNSPs on the line as well in terms of how they will be making these costs transparent through their pricing proposals. I'm also not aware of, but I think that's a question for the distribution networks and potentially the AER.
Fantastic. Now, the next one is in relation to recent tenders, and I think it's probably also for you, Melanie, and possibly not sure if you can actually answer it, but for probity and other reasons. But did the most recent tender winners exceed or align with EMO Services expectations with respect to the 2021 IIO outcomes?
So we have a requirement that all of our tenders have to be conducted on the basis of the IIO report. So certainly what the IIO report it says is needed is a key consideration when making those decisions. And I think for the first tender, we awarded more for renewable generation than the current IIO at the time said that we required. So we were tendering for I think it was around 2,500 gigawatt hours per annum, equating to around 950 megawatts, and we awarded 1.4 gigawatts of LTESAs for generation. So in that respect, it exceeded the target. Then for long duration storage, we recommended 50 megawatts. The indicative target was 600 megawatts, but we always intended to procure that 600 megawatts over a number of tenders. So it was, we left it open that we may not support any projects in the first any long duration storage tenders in the first tender, because we had a number of tenders to fill that 600 megawatt requirement. So yeah, we saw it as potentially exceeding what our expectations, that we did in fact award some LTESs. That 50 megawatt LDS project was successful.
Thank you. Now, forgive me if I'm asking this one again. I had thought we'd already responded to it, but is the figure for new, this one's for Shira, is the figure for new wind capacity inclusive of likely large-scale offshore wind developments in the Newcastle and Wollongong regions?
It does not. It does not include those projects.
And perhaps
Fantastic.
I'll expand on that if it's okay, because as Shira mentioned, a lot of that comes from the ISP in terms of its outlook. So in the ISP, we get CSIRO to do the gen cost report, and that gives us technology costs that do show offshore wind is coming down in cost over time. Well, we're sort of working towards our next ISP now, which is going to be in a draft format at the end of the year. And what we've seen is that, yeah, offshore wind is coming down in cost, but also legislation is becoming more ambitious in terms of offshore wind in Australia. So that's perhaps something that we will see a bit more of in the next ISP. And that might continue to filter through to the IIO, as I mentioned earlier. Thanks, Fiona.
Thank you. Now, Ben has another question around wholesale prices. It's probably one for Mel and Eli, around how renewable energy generation, how does it result in lower wholesale prices when it rarely sets the price? Wholesale prices follow gas and hydro prices, not renewable energy generation volumes. So over to Mel first and then Eli, I guess.
Maybe one for the modelers. I was going to suggest
Okay.
Shira or Dane.
Happy to start, and feel free to jump in there, Dane and Eli. Renewable energy, as this question suggests, renewable energy generators typically bid really low. Their short-run marginal costs are really low. While often the prices are set currently by generators that have a high short-run marginal cost, such as gas, we are expecting, with a greater penetration of renewables and greater penetration of low short-run marginal cost projects, for the price to be set more and more frequently by low short-run marginal cost generators, such as renewable energy. We do report on wholesale cost forecasts in our report, so people can look at that, but it is about the changing mix over time.
And perhaps I'll just add to that in the IIO, we do optimize resources. So it's an optimization of that renewable energy and generation, and then storage and transmission. So really, it's not just that renewables are coming in and making the price cheaper, it's that there's an optimization, and the framework can trigger a wider range of investments. But also, I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of price setting happens outside of the wholesale market. So there will be swaps and trades and power purchase agreements, so that not everything relates to just the wholesale price, which is, as the person noted, often set by gas generation or other sort of scheduled services.
Thank you very much. Okay, so somebody has asked as well, and this is one for you, Mel, around short-term storage and firming target. It seems quite small in proportion to generation and LDS. Could you please expand on why this might be the case?
Sure. So the firming infrastructure, the 380 megawatts that we calculated back in the 2022 IIO report, that was to address what was identified at that time as the breach in the energy security target that's calculated by AEMO. And that was specifically around the key event of 25-26, when the EST monitor forecast that there would be a shortfall at that period of around 380 megawatts, and assumptions are continuing to update. The reason that it's not larger and that we don't see any more firming infrastructure coming into our development pathway is because of the other developments that are happening, including the 2 gigawatts of long duration storage that does come online, as well as important projects, particularly the Hunter Transmission project that comes in that alleviates some of the constraints getting into the Sydney, Newcastle, Wollongong area. Assuming that project can be delivered on time, then that will, and along with the 2 gigawatts of long duration storage and all the renewable that we have coming online by the development pathway, that should all those things be successful, then we don't see the need for more firming infrastructure. Of course, there's risks with all of those things occurring, and so we will continue to monitor those things, as will AEMO as the EST monitor and the New South Wales government. And then we do have an expectation that any of those risks materialise, then potentially we will be directed to run another firming infrastructure tender in the medium term.
Thank you. Now, the next question is, I think, potentially for Eli, otherwise maybe Shira and Mel, and it's around wholesale cost estimates. So do the wholesale cost estimates consider at all the intraday variability of daytime low operational demand and evening peak demand versus limited low carbon generation?
I'm happy to start off, Eli, and jump in here. The answer is yes. The wholesale cost estimates that we present in the report do consider the shape, if you like, of prices as they change across the day, and how they vary where there's lots of solar behind the meter, and therefore lower operational demand during the middle of the day versus in the evening, and how the price changes to increase based on higher peak demand in those times. It considers not only the half-hourly sort of detailed prices and how they change over time, but also how demand changes. And it's a multiplication of those two to create consumer costs from the wholesale component.
I don't think I have anything further to add on that. Thanks, Chair. Yeah.
Fantastic. So I guess maybe we might just pop down to the next question, which is around, I think it's probably one for you, Mel. So some of the winners of the first LTESA were existing generators. Shouldn't the tender select new additional generation/storage projects rather than existing?
So the first LTESA tender did select a project, part of which was already committed and close to existing. The ability to order LTESAs to existing projects was a critical part of the policy when it was introduced. The policy specified that any project that was committed after November 19, the time at which the policy came in, would be eligible. And that was really deliberate to avoid, I guess, a slowdown in investment. It is quite critical to our process that investors can continue to move forward with their projects and not get held up because they're waiting for a particular tender to occur, or because even if they are not successful in one tender, we don't want them to delay them. We want them to keep moving to the next stage of investment, so that they can come to the tender even when they can keep trying until they're successful, even if that is once they're existing. So that will continue to be a core part of our tenders, that projects can keep going and not have to wait for a tender, because the speed of this transmission is absolutely paramount to achieving our targets.
Thank you. Now, the next question is also for you, Mel. It's from Sam. The question is, the optimal timing in the IIO for the CWO RES is 2027 to 28. Is the Southern Extension modelled? Question. The NIS and the Draft IIO for option 1 appear different.
Maybe I'll talk about generally the NIS and the IIO, and then maybe Shira, if you could respond to the specifics. So the network infrastructure options in the IIO report and the NIS are not directly comparable. We intend to consider the NIS as a key input into all our IIO reports moving forward, and to co-optimise generation, storage and network infrastructure every report that we do. The Draft IIO report presents the RES network infrastructure options consistent with the inputs that we received at the time. So Energy Co provided us their inputs in terms of the cost and the timing of network infrastructure options. And then Energy Co used the results of our modelling. So the modelling we're presenting here is the same modelling that was used to inform the network infrastructure strategy. So Energy Co used the outputs of our modelling to help inform its NIS, but it also included other considerations such as social licence and the need to provide insurance value if we if there are changes to demand and those sorts of things. So the final NIS that Energy Co presented, because it did consider those other factors, isn't 100% consistent with the inputs that we use. What we're intending to do for the final IIO is then to iterate again and take the inputs from Energy Co's final NIS and include those in the final 2023 IIO report, so they should be consistent at that time. But Shira, did you want to talk about the specifics of the CWO option?
Yeah, so I guess the questioner is correct in noting that the options aren't the same between the NIS and the IIO report, the draft IIO report. As Melanie mentioned, we are looking to consider the latest information for the final IIO report in terms of the network options for CWO and all the other New South Wales reses.
Thank you very much. Now, the next question is for Shira as well. I believe it's from Lawrence. It's around the new generation tender sizes, and are they constrained by the annual build limit of 6,000 gigawatt hours per annum in the modelling? And do these limits reflect latest market conditions?
That's right. So the development pathway is influenced somewhat by the fact that to date, including in the modelling presented in the 2023 draft IIO report, we apply a supply chain constraint, and that supply chain constraint limits the amount of additional new capacity that can enter in any given year, and that limit is informed by historical outcomes around how much has been able to be delivered in a given year, to avoid development pathway that has really lumpy builds in a given year in a way that is inconsistent with historical observation of the supply chains. We are really interested on feedback on this assumption. We are looking to test how reasonable it is and how we should be applying it. I'll also note that it is something that AEMO is thinking about, and maybe Eli, I don't know if you want to touch on this as a sensitivity.
Yeah, we're still exploring our list of sensitivities. We're consulting on the methodology right now, and we're working towards finalising our inputs and assumptions. But even after we publish our draft ISP at the end of the year, if there are specific sensitivities that people think would add rigour to that project, yeah, please let us know, and yeah, we can definitely consider adding different sensitivities to explore those sorts of things.
Thank you both. Now, another question around the modelling and the assumptions. So for you, Shira, can you share the assumptions that were included in your base model, please?
We do have a section in the draft 2023 IIO report where we outline a lot of our assumptions. If there are specific questions around assumptions that we haven't presented on that anyone is interested in, we'll be happy to take those questions and see if we're able to respond to them directly.
Thanks very much. Now, the next question is around the requirement for LDS due to take up of rooftop PV and distributed storage that are usually SDS. What about LDS will reduce the grid requirements? Maybe that's one for Mel.
Yeah, so I guess the question is getting towards why do we have an LDS target and why 8 hours? And I think that's is part of our legislation is the easy answer, that there is a requirement for us to run tenders for long duration storage, and that has to be 8 hours or more. The initial policy included that 8-hour requirement because it was foreseen that longer duration storage is likely to be required to meet reliability needs in the future, and that there wasn't a mechanism at that time to support those types of projects. That shorter duration projects are more likely to get up and be economic without further support, and that there was seen to be a need to support longer duration storage. So that's why the target came through the policy, but for us it's our legislative requirement to meet, and so we are bound by that number.
Thank you. Okay, the next question is from Penny, and it's another one for you, Mel. It's the LTESA contracts have provisions for local social and economic benefits. How will the commitments made by tender winners be communicated to the public?
I think we'll have to take that one on notice. It goes slightly outside of the remit of the IIO report, but yeah, happy to respond to that question, and our commercial team who runs the tender process would be happy to provide a response.
Fantastic. And I think this next one is for Eli. It's around so Eli, it's one around what actions is AEMO taking to fully compensate local environmental, social and economic costs so rural communities are more supportive of transmission lines?
Thanks, Fiona. This is a really good question. It's probably not specifically one for AEMO rather than one for the New South Wales government or EnergyCo, but I can speak to my visibility on it. Like social license is a huge consideration here, and it's going to be what makes or breaks most plans in the energy sector right now. So it's really important that it's done proactively and done right. So the New South Wales government did release the Strategic Benefits Payment Scheme, which talks about $200,000 per kilometre of transmission for major projects for people that host the land that carries that transmission infrastructure. So I know that's one of the things that's being done in regard to cost, but I'm confident that EnergyCo and the network operator who's selected as the sort of person to deliver that infrastructure in each zone will be taking a lot of focus on those things to make sure that it's following best practices wherever possible.
Thank you. Now, we've only probably got time for one or two more questions. So I might direct the next one to Mel, which is around how do the wholesale costs forecast compare with the previous IIO report?
Yeah, thank you for the question. There has been an increase between the 2021 and 2022 IIO reports and this draft 2023 IIO report. A lot of that is driven by, well, we have seen significant increases in wholesale electricity prices since that 2021 reports, and that's due to a combination of factors, including unplanned outages of coal-fired generation and supply chain issues for coal and gas. The costs have increased between our two forecasts, partly because of coal and gas price forecasts, which we updated between those two reports, driven directly by those supply chain constraints. We also have further delays to the assumed timing of projects, including Snowy 2.0, Project Energy Connect, which have also pushed prices up, and delays to some of the RES network projects' earliest timing, including for Central West Orana and New England RES. And another driver of the cost increase is more updated information on the cost of New South Wales transmission projects compared to the 2021 and 2022 IIO reports.
Thank you. Now we will just have Eli, I'll just throw the very last question to you, and then if you can just come back to me and I'll talk a bit about next steps and a survey that we'd really like people to answer. The last question is that the AEMO services is New South Wales centric. Is there an anticipation to implement this strategy into other states?
Thanks. Another really good question for the states to consider. So this is probably brings us to the fact that there's a lot of differences between the states in relation to asset ownership. So whether things are public versus private owned, and the different focuses on things like regional development and jobs and other matters that are important to governments. So in Queensland, we've got the Queensland Energy and Jobs Plan. We've got this electricity infrastructure investment framework in New South Wales. Victoria has a lot of change going on with VicGrid, with SECV, and the National Electricity Victoria Amendment Framework, or NEVA. In South Australia, you've got the Hydrogen Jobs Plan, and in Tasmania, they've announced RECFIT. The department in Tasmania has announced their preference for renewable energy zone planning, and they've announced a res that they intend to potentially go first. They're still engaging on it. So there's a lot happening in the different states, but they're all just a little bit different because of the sort of nuances and different approaches to energy planning from the different state governments.
I'll also add that one of the reasons AMO Services was established as AMO under the National Market Operator is that there was an intention that AMO Services could provide services to other jurisdictions, that there was a gap for an organisation that had commercial capabilities to run these tenders, financial markets capabilities to manage the contracts, because these are quite complex financial derivatives that we're tendering, and also energy expertise. So we are an organisation that combines those three skill sets, and it was identified by the original minister, Minister Keane, that this entity should be national to help support the NEM, and so to drive consistency between the states if that's possible.
Fantastic, thank you. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. As I mentioned, that was the last question for today. So thank you to Eli, Shira, Melanie and Dane for being able to answer so many questions on the spot. And I'm sorry that we haven't gotten to all of the questions, but as you would have seen earlier, there are many ways that you can ask your questions and provide your feedback. So we encourage you to visit the AMO Services website to do that. So again, and thank you all on the call today for joining us. So we really hope that the webinar has been informative and that it has answered some of your questions. We're also hoping that you can complete a survey on Slido to provide your feedback on which topics AMO Services should prioritise for deep dive sessions that are going to be held next week. So to do that, you can use the same Slido link that you used for the Q&A. The poll's live now. So in your Slido backend, you'll see that there are kind of two tabs on the page. One is for asking questions and answers, and the other one is polls. So just use the polls tab on the Slido page, and the poll will be open for voting on the deep dive topics until probably about 1 o'clock. So we'll leave it open for the next hour. And once the voting is finalised, we'll host the webinars about the deep dive topics that you're most interested in. So please keep your eyes peeled for an invitation to these sessions in your inbox. And of course, don't forget to make your submissions to the email address provided earlier in today's session. And the details are of course available on the AMO Services website. So I might get you to pop to the next slide and just really quickly finish up. So the AMO Services web address is up there now for you. Thank you again for joining us. And just another reminder, so please make your submissions, join the team for deep dives next week and respond to the survey on Slido by 1 p.m. today. Thanks very much.